The morning Patricia Holloway's Tesla Model S appeared on my home energy management system's unauthorized device log at 2:14 in the morning. I was asleep, but my system was not. And when the alert reached my phone at 7:42 during my morning review of overnight events, I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee and looked at the data for a long time before I did anything else. Because the data was telling me something specific, and I wanted to understand exactly what it was telling me before I decided what to do about it. The data was telling me that someone had accessed the exterior level 2 charging outlet on the south wall of my garage at 2:14 in the morning, had initiated a charging session that had run for 4 hours and 19 minutes, had drawn 22.4 kilowatt hours of electricity from my home electrical system, and had disconnected at 6:33 in the morning. The device that had connected was identifiable through the charging session's signature as a Tesla Model S, with a battery state consistent with approximately 40% charge at connection and approximately 85% charge at disconnection. I knew one Tesla Model S in the Cedarwood Commons HOA development in Central Virginia, where I lived. My name is Nathan Reeves. I am 49 years old, a licensed electrical engineer and energy systems consultant with 21 years of experience in residential and commercial power management, smart grid technology, and electrical infrastructure design, and I have lived in the Cedarwood Commons HOA development for 6 years. My wife Clara is a university librarian. Our house is a 4-bedroom contemporary on a corner lot with an attached 2-car garage whose south exterior wall faced the common pathway that connected the eastern cluster of homes. The garage had 2 electrical features relevant to this story. First, a level 2 EV charging station inside the garage that I used for my own electric vehicle. Second, a level 2 charging outlet on the exterior south wall that I had installed 2 years ago as a convenience feature for when I needed to charge a vehicle without opening the garage door, which I used occasionally and which I had not, as the overnight session made clear, secured against unauthorized use. That second point was a design gap I had not prioritized because I had not anticipated it would be relevant. I was correcting it the morning of the alert while simultaneously beginning to understand how long the gap had existed and how many times it had been used. Patricia Holloway had moved to Cedarwood Commons 11 months ago. She was 54, a retired marketing executive from Atlanta, and she drove a Tesla Model S in a shade of deep red that she referred to as Midnight Cherry, which was a Tesla color designation I had verified because I am the kind of person who verifies things. She lived in Unit 19, 3 units east of mine, and had access to the common pathway that ran between our properties. Her unit had a standard single-car garage with no EV charging infrastructure, which I knew because she had asked me at a neighborhood gathering 8 months ago about the process for installing a home charger, and I had described the permit requirements and suggested she contact her HOA for approval before beginning work. She had apparently identified an alternative to installing her own charger. After I reviewed the overnight alert, I pulled my energy management system's full historical log, which stored 90 days of data. The exterior outlet had a separate circuit monitor that logged every event on that circuit with timestamps, energy delivery figures, and connection duration. I had not been reviewing those logs regularly because I had not considered the exterior outlet a monitoring priority. I reviewed them that morning from the beginning of the stored period. 31 sessions. The first was 67 days ago. Sessions occurred on a pattern that showed Tuesday and Thursday nights consistently, occasional Sunday nights, and 3 Saturday nights scattered through the period. Session duration ranged from 2 hours and 40 minutes to 5 hours and 12 minutes. Total energy delivered across 31 sessions was 487 kilowatt hours. 487 kilowatt hours at my current Virginia rate was $63.31. The dollar figure was not the point. I had spent more than that on things I had chosen to spend it on. The point was that someone had been accessing my electrical infrastructure at 2 in the morning for 67 days with a regularity that implied a routine, which implied an expectation of continued access, which implied an assumption that the access was either permitted or too low risk to be detected. I called my attorney Daniel Cross before I called anyone else. I had retained Daniel 3 years ago for a property boundary matter and had kept him on retainer because I believed in having legal counsel accessible before situations required it urgently. I described what my logs showed. He said, "She has been charging her Tesla on your electricity for 67 days. I said 31 documented sessions, 487 kilowatt hours total. He said at 2 in the morning. I said sessions typically start between midnight and 2:30. I believe she is initiating charges when she believes the likelihood of being observed is lowest. He said, "Do you have camera coverage of the exterior outlet?" I said no. The outlet is on the south wall under the garage eave. My camera coverage on that side covers the driveway and the path approach, but not the outlet itself directly. He said, "Can you see a vehicle parked at the outlet from any camera?" I said, "A vehicle parked close enough to the south wall to connect to the outlet would be visible from the eastern property camera at the corner of the garage. I am reviewing that footage now." I reviewed it while Daniel waited on the phone. The eastern camera covered the corner of the garage and the path approach. A vehicle parked along the south wall would appear in the lower right portion of the frame at the path-adjacent position. I found the first session from 67 days ago and looked at the footage for that time window. A dark red Tesla Model S was parked along the south wall of my garage, with its charge port open. I said camera footage confirms a Tesla Model S in the correct position during the first documented session. Daniel said, "Plate." The camera angle was not optimal for plate capture, but the lower right section of the frame showed the rear of the vehicle at an angle that captured 2 characters clearly and 3 more partially. I described them to Daniel. He said, "Combined with the color, the make, the model, and the charging session signature, I think we have sufficient identification for a formal complaint. But I want to think about this carefully before we move." I said, "What are you thinking about?" He said she has been doing this for 67 days in what appears to be a deliberate pattern that she believes is undetected. She will continue to do it. Before we confront her directly, I want to give you the option of building a more complete record. How long would it take you to install proper camera coverage of the outlet and add a monitoring layer that would document future sessions with better evidence quality? I said I can have a camera covering the outlet within 24 hours. The monitoring layer I want to add is different from what I currently have and will take 3 days. He said, "Tell me about the monitoring layer." I said I am going to install a circuit isolator on the exterior outlet that allows me to remotely control whether the outlet is energized. I will also add a session logger at the outlet level that captures not just energy delivery, but the vehicle identifier from the charging handshake protocol, which is a more definitive identification than the session signature I have now. He said the charging handshake protocol identifies specific vehicles. I said Level 2 EV charging uses a communication protocol during session initiation that includes vehicle identification data. My current system captures a session signature, but not the direct vehicle identifier. A dedicated outlet-level logger will capture the full handshake data, including the vehicle's identification string. He said, "And the circuit isolator?" I said, "Allows me to de-energize the outlet remotely. If I want to document that she attempted to charge and was prevented, I can isolate the circuit and log the attempt without delivering energy." Daniel said, "You are building a trap." I said, "I am building documentation infrastructure. The trap is her continued assumption that this is undetected." He said, "I like the distinction, install everything, give it 2 weeks, then we contact her with the complete record." I installed the camera above the south garage eave on Saturday morning, a position that gave direct coverage of the outlet and the adjacent wall section. I installed the session logger at the circuit panel Saturday afternoon. I installed the remote isolator Sunday morning and tested it 3 times with my own vehicle to confirm reliable operation. The full installation was operational by Sunday evening. The Tuesday night session came 4 days later. At 1:57 in the morning, my phone showed the session logger alert. Deep red Tesla Model S charge port open. Session initiation handshake captured with complete vehicle identification string. Camera footage showed the vehicle parked along the south wall, Patricia visible through the driver's window checking her phone while the session initiated. I had the camera footage, the session logger data with the vehicle identification string, the energy delivery measurement, and the timestamp. The documentation was definitive. I let the session complete. She charged for 3 hours and 41 minutes and disconnected at 5:38 and drove away. I noted all of it. The Thursday night session came 2 days later. Same process, same documentation quality. I let it complete. The following Tuesday, I did something different. At 1:49 in the morning, when the session logger alert showed her vehicle connecting, I waited 4 minutes to allow the handshake and session initiation to complete and generate a full documentation record. Then I activated the circuit isolator. The outlet de-energized. The charging session terminated on Patricia's end. I watched the camera feed. Patricia got out of the Tesla and examined the outlet. She tried reconnecting the cable twice. The outlet was de-energized and would not initiate a session. She stood at the wall for approximately 2 minutes examining the outlet and the area around it. Then she got back in the Tesla and drove away. The documentation of the termination session showed that she had connected, that a session had initiated, and that the session had been remotely terminated after 4 minutes. The camera showed her examining the outlet and attempting to reconnect. The session log showed 2 reconnection attempts. I had documentation of 34 sessions over 79 days, clear camera footage of Patricia and her vehicle in all of the final 5 sessions, vehicle identification string from the handshake logger, and documented evidence that when the outlet was de-energized, she had remained and attempted to reconnect rather than leaving immediately, which established that the presence of her vehicle at my outlet was purposeful and deliberate rather than incidental. I sent everything to Daniel on Wednesday morning. He reviewed it that afternoon and called me. He said, "The vehicle identification string is the clearest evidence I have seen in this type of case. It is the electrical equivalent of a fingerprint." I said the charging handshake protocol is designed for billing and network management purposes. It was not designed as evidence capture, but it functions that way. He said 34 sessions, vehicle identification on all 5 monitored sessions, camera footage on 5 sessions, and a documented intentional reconnection attempt after remote termination. I said yes. He said the energy cost is $63. I said the dollar figure is not the point. He said I know. The point is unauthorized access to your residential electrical infrastructure on 34 occasions over 79 days in a deliberate pattern that she believed was undetected. I said, and the assumption of continued access that the deliberate pattern implies. He said, I am going to send a formal demand letter today, and I want you to be prepared for a range of responses. Some people in her position become cooperative immediately when they understand the documentation exists. Others become defensive. Either way, we have a strong record. The demand letter went to Patricia that afternoon by email and certified mail. It was 8 pages. It documented all 34 sessions with timestamps and energy delivery figures. It attached the camera footage stills from the 5 monitored sessions showing her vehicle and her presence. It attached the vehicle identification strings from the handshake logs. It attached the energy cost calculation and a demand for reimbursement of that cost, plus all of Daniel's fees, plus compensatory damages for the sustained unauthorized use. Patricia called me 40 minutes after the email arrived. She was not using the voice I had expected, which was either defensive or apologetic. She was using a quiet voice that I had not heard from her before, a voice that belonged to someone who had just read 8 pages of documentation of something they had believed was undetected and had understood in the reading that it had not been undetected for some time. She said, "You knew." I said, "I discovered the pattern 11 days ago. I had been logging exterior outlet activity without active monitoring. When I reviewed the historical logs, I found 31 sessions going back 67 days. I then installed direct monitoring and documented 5 additional sessions." She said, "The Tuesday night when it stopped." I said, "I remotely de-energized the circuit." She said, "You were watching." I said I was asleep. The system was watching. The alert went to my phone and I reviewed it in the morning. She said, "You built a system." I said, "I installed monitoring infrastructure appropriate for the situation after discovering the situation." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I did not think you would notice." I said, "My energy management system logs every circuit event. I did not review the exterior outlet logs regularly because I had not considered it a monitoring priority. That has been corrected." She said, "I know I owe you for the electricity." I said, "Patricia, $63 is not the conversation. 34 sessions over 79 days in a deliberate pattern that you believed was undetected is the conversation. The demand letter describes what I am seeking." She said, "How much?" I said, "My attorney fees for the period of investigation and documentation, the energy cost, and compensatory damages for the sustained unauthorized use of my residential electrical infrastructure. The total is in the letter." She said, "I need to call someone." I said, "Please have your attorney contact Daniel Cross." She retained a local attorney named Marcus Webb, who called Daniel the following day. Marcus had reviewed the letter and the documentation, and his tone in describing his position to Daniel was, as Daniel told me afterward, the tone of an attorney who had reviewed complete and technically sophisticated evidence and had updated his assessment of the situation accordingly. Marcus's opening position was that his client had made a genuine error in assuming the exterior outlet was a community amenity rather than private residential infrastructure. Daniel said, "The outlet is on the south wall of my client's private garage. It is not labeled as a community amenity. The common pathway does not have electrical outlets. There are no community amenity outlets in this development. The assumption that a privately installed outlet on a private garage wall is a community amenity is not a reasonable assumption." Marcus said, "My client was unaware of the technical monitoring capabilities your client had installed." Daniel said, "The monitoring capability is not relevant to the authorization question. The outlet was private residential infrastructure regardless of whether it was monitored. The monitoring simply documented what was occurring." Marcus said, "The vehicle identification string." Daniel said, "Is a definitive identification derived from the standard Level 2 charging handshake protocol. It was captured by a session logger installed at the circuit level on my client's own electrical panel. The identification is as definitive as a serial number." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My client wants to resolve this." The settlement negotiation took 2 weeks. The final number was $14,200. Patricia paid it personally. Her homeowner's insurance reviewed the claim and determined that the sustained intentional conduct over 79 days fell outside accidental occurrence coverage provisions. The HOA board received a copy of the settlement documentation from Daniel and held a meeting to discuss the implications. The board sent a community-wide notice reminding residents that exterior electrical outlets on private homes were private infrastructure, that using another resident's electrical outlets without permission constituted unauthorized use of private property, and that the development had no community EV charging infrastructure. The notice also announced that the board was evaluating options for installing community EV charging in the guest parking area, which had apparently been a recurring discussion item that the incident had finally moved to active planning. I installed a lockout cover on the exterior outlet the week after the settlement. It was a weatherproof cover with a key lock that prevented access to the outlet face without the correct key. The cover was rated for outdoor use and matched the garage exterior color. It cost $18. Daniel called me after the settlement was finalized. He said $14,200 for $63 of electricity. I said the $63 was the quantifiable direct cost. The $14,000 covers the documentation, the legal work, and the value of 34 unauthorized accesses to my residential electrical infrastructure. He said the vehicle identification string was the decisive element. When Marcus understood that his client's vehicle had been identified by name through a standard protocol she had not known was being logged, he understood the exposure. I said the protocol is not secret. It is documented in the SAE J1772 standard, which covers Level 2 AC charging in North America. Anyone with a Level 2 EV charging installation and sufficient technical knowledge to install a session logger would have access to that identification data. He said she did not know you were technically sophisticated enough to extract it. I said she did not know I was monitoring at all. The sophistication of the monitoring was secondary to its existence. He said you knew she would not expect monitoring. I said I knew that someone who accesses another person's electrical outlet at 2 in the morning for 34 sessions believes the access is undetected. That belief requires that no monitoring exists. The belief was incorrect. He said, because you discovered it. I said, because my system logged it and I reviewed the logs. The monitoring had been running the entire time. I simply had not been looking at those particular logs. He said, the trap was already live before you knew it existed. I said, yes, that is an accurate description. He said that is either a remarkable coincidence or a remarkable system. I said it is a comprehensive energy management system of the type I design professionally. The comprehensiveness is not coincidental. I designed it to log everything because incomplete logging produces incomplete data, and incomplete data is a professional liability in energy systems work. He said the professional standard produced the evidence. I said the professional standard produced the documentation. She provided the evidence by using my outlet 34 times. He said good night, and I said good night, and I closed the documentation folder and put it in the filing cabinet. Clara was in the living room reading when I came in from the home office. She looked up and said, resolved. I said settlement paid, lockout cover installed. Community charging notice sent. She said the Tesla. I said $14,200 for 487 kilowatt hours. She said that is approximately $29 per kilowatt hour. I said that is the cost of doing it the way she did it rather than installing her own charger. Clara said, how much would a charger installation have cost? I said, depending on panel capacity and permit requirements, $800 to $2,000. She said she paid $14,000 to avoid $2,000. I said she paid $14,000 because she did not consider the possibility that the system she was using was monitoring her use. Clara said, because it was 2 in the morning. I said, because 2 in the morning reduces the probability of human observation. It does not reduce the probability of system observation. She said, systems do not sleep. I said, no, they do not. She went back to her book. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table and looked at nothing in particular for a while, thinking about monitoring systems and what they logged, and why comprehensive logging mattered, and what it meant to design something correctly, and have that correct design produce evidence you had not anticipated needing when you designed it. The session logger was still running. The camera was still mounted above the south eave. The remote isolator was still installed on the circuit. The lockout cover meant that none of those monitoring systems would be triggered again for the purpose they had been triggered for over the past 79 days. But they were there, running correctly, logging whatever happened on that circuit, because comprehensive systems do not stop being comprehensive when the immediate problem is resolved. That was the design standard. It had always been the design standard. The standard was what made the system work. Thumbnail text: she charged her Tesla on his electricity 34 times at 2 am. His energy system had been logging every session since day one.